Man, they gonna see you.
In some of the worst cases ever seen in Detroit, these killers get life sentences. Let's watch how they react. Number 4. 3 men sentenced. 3 men will spend the rest of their lives in prison for taking the life of a Clinton Township, Detroit party store owner. Darius Diaz Gaskin, Jomar Robinson, and Kenneth Hill were found guilty of Basil Sulaka's passing. Kenneth Hill, 27 years old, and Jomar Robinson, 26 years old, both of Clinton Township, and Darius Diaz Gaskin, 25 years old, of Detroit, were tried together in Macomb County Circuit Court and found guilty of the first-degree armed robbery, felony firearm possession, and conspiracy to commit armed robbery.
I hope that while you spend the rest of your life in prison, you actually reflect on the awful decisions you've made in your life. You have the blood of a loving father, husband, son, and brother on your hands. To the killers who murdered my brother in cold blood, I say this to you. You're an absolute disgrace to the human race. I hope you are haunted and reminded every day by all the ill choices you have made.
The 51-year-old Sulaka was destroyed on March 28, 2014, when suspects who were masked and armed stormed the Moonlight Party store. 2 of the men emptied the cash registers and kept watch on the door, while another shot Sulaka in the back with a handgun. A 4th man, Clinton Grayson, was sentenced earlier to life in prison without parole on a first-degree felony charge and other charges as a jury found him guilty. Sulaka had owned the party store for 18 years. He was married with 2 daughters. Vivian Sulaka, Basim Sulaka's sister, said he was a peaceful man who didn't keep a gun at his store, nor did he install thick plexiglass. She said her brother told his employees that if a robbery happened, hand over your money. Money comes and goes, but you only get one life. During closing arguments of the trial, Richard Glanda, lawyer for Diaz Gaskin, who is said to have shot Sulaka, said his client thought the gun's safety was on. All 3 men were sentenced to life in prison without parole.
What does that mean? Fill us in, because you know what? I'm a little worried for them. What more could you possibly want to take from this family, yet insult them and threaten them and say, this ain't over yet?
I know I wasn't talking to them. I know for a fact I wasn't.
Well, who were you talking to?
I was talking to my family.
This ain't over yet,
I didn't say the B word. You could play the record.
If I could give you an extra 10 years, I would, but I can't.
Number 3, Jeffrey Clark. Jeffrey Clark and Tamara Scott were charged with the slaying of Jeray Robinson. Police say Clark is facing several charges, including the first degree. Scott is accused of helping Clark get away after the incident. The incident happened after Clark got into a confrontation with the Robertson in Roseville. During the confrontation, Clark began to fire shots at the victim and continued to do so as he ran into Fraser. Prosecutors said at that point Jeffrey Clark happens to be in a vehicle with the co-defendant who drove around 13 Mile and found a victim running northbound in Fraser. He got out of the vehicle at 13 Mile and fatally shot him in the parking lot at Joy and Franklin. At the time of the incident, the defendant had a tether on his ankle and records placed him at the location. Clark's co-defendant Scott was charged with accessory after the fact. Prosecutors say she jumped into the driver's seat, drove the vehicle into the parking lot, and picked up Clark after the incident. Her attorney says she does not have a criminal background and acted out of fear, saying she calls 911 on the day in question and attempted to alert authorities. The actions done after the fact, we're done, so I fear. The judge denied the bond for Clark but allowed it for Scott. Jeffrey Clark was in a Macomb County courtroom, and during his preliminary hearing, which is when the prosecution presents evidence that they want to use in the trial. Among the evidence was the surveillance video, which showed a victim laying in the parking lot and another man standing over him with a gun, firing it multiple times.
He told me exactly what he did to Mr. Robertson. He told me that Mr. Robertson begged for his life. He proceeded to tell me that he would kill me if I told on him, and that the only thing he was worried about was that he was on tether.
The victim is laying on his side, rolling back and forth, and he holds his hand up as if asking the man to stop. The video showed at least one shot being fired, but a tree partially obscures the view. The suspect then walks away from the victim, leaving him for dead in the parking lot. After the video was played in court, the prosecution was preparing to introduce more evidence of a Nest video recording. As the prosecution was working to show the video, a sudden outburst occurred in the court as Clark was attacked by Robertson's twin brother. The man hit Clark multiple times in the back of his head and back. Clark tried to fight back but was hindered by the waist restraint which chains his wrists to a chain around his waist. The two men are ultimately separated by attorneys and deputies in the courtroom. As Clark is led through the courtroom door, he yells, "They're going to see you," at the other man.
Man, they gonna see you.
The man is being taken into custody in the courtroom as the father of the suspect gets into a yelling match with another man. Robertson's brother is ultimately handcuffed and sat down in the courtroom. The father of the suspect is later heard apologizing multiple times for his actions. Peace was eventually restored to the courtroom and the preliminary hearing continued. Clark was ultimately bound over for trial for the first degree. It's not clear what charges Robertson's brother will face. Macomb County Prosecutor Pete Lucido said in July that Robertson was executed and begging for his life. "I can say after reviewing the evidence, this was an execution. The man was pleading for his life."
We have members of the victim's family, the defendant's family were present, so it's an emotional case. I mean, obviously we have an individual who was shot repeatedly. It's no surprise that emotions are involved. It's unfortunate that they decided to let those emotions unleash in the court.
Number 2, D'Angelo Martin. D'Angelo Martin terrorized Detroit's East Side in 2019 and took the lives of 4 different women. He will spend at least 45 years in prison after pleading guilty to second-degree charges. Martin pleaded guilty to the slayings of 4 women and the physical exploitation of 10 others. As part of his plea agreement, he will be sentenced to between 45 and 70 years in prison for each count, which will be served concurrently. The 37-year-old was bound over for trial for the 4 cases and was expected to go before a jury, but instead a plea deal was reached and was sentenced in Wayne County. Martin was arrested after police were notified of a decomposing body found inside a vacant Detroit home on Mack Avenue. However, he's also been linked to slayings on Winthrop Street in February 2018 and 2 slayings in March 2019 on Coventry Street and Lindenhurst Street. When Martin was bound over for trial, he was bound with destroying Annetta Nelson, 57 years old, Nancy Harrison, 52, Trevesine Ellis, 55, and Tamara Jones, 55. They were all from Detroit.
It's my mother so much. I've had nightmares every night. I'm grateful for the one man that found my sister in that house, black and blue, blood in her face. This man had the decency to bring my sister out.
During the sentencing, family members spoke about how their lives have changed. Among the family members was Gary Harrison, the father of Nancy Harrison. He said, "We miss Nancy. Nancy had a little problem, but she owned her own home, paid all of her bills, and every once in a while she'd go over to Detroit. That's where her mistake was."
You don't deserve to see daylight or another day in your life. She'll never be able to meet my babies, ever.
She had a little problem, but she owned her own home. She paid all of her bills, and every once in a while she'd go over to Detroit. And that's where the mistake was.
This gentleman had no reason for taking people's lives. Now he's going to be doing some time, and he looks upstairs and asks that man for forgiveness.
He said his daughter will never know his grandkids, both of whom were born after her passing. Harrison's brother, Timothy, spoke next and said that he was bitter about what Martin did. He said, "It's been a rough 3.5 years. Every day we think about Nancy. This gentleman here knows my sister. He knew my sister. He knew Nancy had a heart. Shame on him. I'm going to say a prayer for this gentleman. I'm bitter, very much so." The last person to speak in court was Martin himself, who, in a very brief and barely audible statement, said that it was not his wrongdoing. But the judge reminded him of his plea deal and the evidence against him before sentencing him to 45 to 70 years in prison. Martin had been connected to 2 other slayings, Deborah Reynolds and Yvonne Corbin. But he was never charged in the cases. Martin's crimes detailed in hearings and filings shocked the victim's family when he appeared in court in 2019. Family of the victim said at the time they believed it took authorities too long to arrest and charge Martin.
I just want to apologize for the people that went through.
Mr. Martin, the court just does not believe the statements that you're making.
Vengeance is the Lord. So what's going to come will come.
Today is the day you rot. That's all I gotta say.
Number 1, Clifford Thomas. Wild scenes broke out in a U.S. courtroom when a father lashed out at the man that took the daughter's life and punched him in the head. The incident happened during the sentencing of Jasmine Gordon and her boyfriend Clifford Thomas, who were both convicted in the demise of Gordon's 3-year-old daughter, Jamila Smith. Jamila's father, Dwayne Smith, was about to deliver his victim impact statement when he crossed paths with Thomas and punched him in the head. Officers from Wayne County Sheriff's Office quickly separated the pair as loud yelling erupted in the courtroom. In the video, Gordon can be seen crying and yelling Jesus as her lawyer, John McWilliams, tries to console her. "It was pretty scary," Mr. McWilliams said. Jamila passed away in September 2014 after her mother, Jasmine Gordon, and Gordon's husband, Clifford Thomas, took her to the hospital where she stopped breathing. The couple claimed that the little girl hit her head and then fell unconscious, but experts later determined that the girl passed away after suffering physical punches from Thomas. Jamila Smith passed away from multiple blunt force trauma injuries. Her passing has been ruled a homicide. Both Gordon and Thomas were convicted of involuntary slaying charges, and Smith was not allowed to return to the courtroom but managed to avoid charges of his own. No charges were pursued against those involved as the judge declined to hold Dwayne Smith in contempt of court. Clifford Thomas refused prosecution of Smith, a Wayne County Sheriff's Office spokeswoman said. Smith was one of the victims in court set to address the couple, but instead of speaking his frustrations, he decided to physically attack Thomas. After the fight, Smith was ordered out of the courtroom and now allowed to return. However, the judge decided not to hold him in contempt of court, and he was allowed to go without facing any charges for the tussle. The court took a recess after the fight, but later resumed, and both Gordon and Thomas were sentenced. Gordon was sentenced to 7 to 15 years for involuntary slaying charges and 14 to 25 years for first-degree child exploitation as an aider and abettor, which will be served at the same time. Thomas was sentenced to about 6 years to 15 years for involuntary slaying charges and 1 to 2 years for resisting and obstructing a police officer. That's all for today's video. See you next time.